Republicans in Congress have initiated a procedural mechanism that effectively eliminates the final legal protection Trump has relied upon to shield himself from multiple ongoing investigations and prosecutions. On February 8th, the House Republican leadership formally invoked a rarely used congressional process that strips away the executive privilege claims Trump has maintained since leaving office, removing the last remaining barrier preventing full disclosure of documents and testimony that prosecutors and oversight committees have been seeking for nearly 2 years. This is not another symbolic political gesture or routine legislative maneuvering that will be forgotten within the next news cycle. This represents a deliberate decision by senior Republicans to remove the legal shield that has enabled Trump to resist subpoenas, delay court proceedings, and prevent investigators from accessing evidence that may be critical to understanding the full scope of actions taken during and after his presidency. When the Republican Speaker of the House and the Republican Senate Majority Leader jointly announced that they are stripping executive privilege protections from a former president of their own party, the significance extends far beyond ordinary political disputes over document access or testimony requirements. This action signals a fundamental calculation by party leadership that continued protection of Trump's legal interests has become incompatible with the institutional responsibilities of Congress and the broader electoral interests of the Republican Party. The willingness to take this extraordinary step, despite the inevitable backlash from Trump's most loyal supporters, demonstrates that senior Republicans have concluded the costs of maintaining these protections now exceed any political benefits that might accrue from continued defense of his legal positions. The procedural mechanism being invoked has its origins in legislation passed during the 1970s in the aftermath of Watergate, when Congress established clearer guidelines for how executive privilege should function and when it could be overridden through formal legislative action. The Presidential Records Act and subsequent amendments created a framework where former presidents maintained certain claims to executive privilege over documents created during their time in office, but those claims can be superseded when current executive branch officials determine that disclosure serves important governmental interests, or when Congress formally determines through proper procedures that legislative and oversight functions require access despite privilege assertions. The process requires majority votes in both the House and Senate, specifically authorizing the override of executive privilege for defined categories of documents and testimony. The sequence of events that led to this dramatic action began developing in late January when Republican committee chairmen in both chambers began receiving increasingly urgent briefings from prosecutors and intelligence officials about the impact that Trump's privilege claims were having on multiple investigations. According to sources familiar with these classified briefings, prosecutors presented evidence that Trump had used executive privilege assertions to prevent disclosure of documents showing potential criminal conduct, including obstruction of justice, mishandling of classified information, and abuse of power. Intelligence officials expressed concerns that ongoing privilege disputes were preventing full accounting of how classified materials were handled after Trump left office, creating potential national security risks that could not be adequately assessed or remediated while key documents remained unavailable. These briefings created a dilemma for Republican leadership. On one side stood their political interests in maintaining support from Trump's base and avoiding conflict with the former president. On the other side stood their constitutional responsibilities for congressional oversight, their institutional concerns about executive branch accountability, and growing evidence that privilege claims were being used not to protect legitimate confidential deliberations, but rather to conceal potentially criminal conduct. The decision to move forward with stripping the privilege protections indicates that leadership concluded the institutional and legal considerations outweighed the political risks. The formal process began on February 8th when Speaker Michael Harrison convened a closed session of senior Republican committee chairmen to review the evidence that prosecutors and intelligence officials had presented. According to members who attended, the session lasted nearly 4 hours and included detailed presentations about specific documents that remained unavailable due to privilege claims and testimony that witnesses had refused to provide based on instructions from Trump's legal team. The evidence presented reportedly included court filings showing that Trump had asserted executive privilege over documents that appeared to relate to personal business matters rather than official presidential duties, communications that occurred after he left office when he no longer held any executive authority, and conversations about potential criminal conduct where privilege protection should not apply under established legal doctrine. By the end of that session, the Republican chairman had reached consensus that the privilege claims were legally dubious and were being used primarily to obstruct legitimate investigations rather than to protect confidential presidential deliberations that serve important governmental interests. The group voted unanimously to recommend that the full Republican conference support legislation formally overriding Trump's executive privilege assertions for defined categories of documents and testimony. That recommendation set in motion the procedural steps necessary to bring such legislation to the floor in both chambers. The House moved first, with Speaker Harrison announcing on February 9th that he would bring the privilege override resolution to the floor for a vote within 72 hours. The resolution was drafted to apply specifically to documents created during Trump's presidency that relate to investigations into potential criminal conduct, mishandling of classified information, obstruction of justice, or abuse of power. It explicitly authorized congressional committees and federal prosecutors to access these materials without regard to any executive privilege claims that Trump or his representatives might assert. The resolution included findings that the materials sought are essential to legitimate legislative oversight functions and criminal investigations, that the privilege claims lack legal merit because they involve potential criminal conduct or matters outside the scope of protected presidential deliberations, and that the public interest in accountability and transparency outweighs any residual confidentiality interests. The decision to move forward with this resolution required Republican leadership to carefully manage the internal party dynamics and anticipate the response from Trump and his most loyal supporters. Speaker Harrison held multiple conference calls with Republican members to explain the rationale and to emphasize that the action was necessary to fulfill constitutional responsibilities and to protect the party's credibility on issues of law and order. He argued that allowing Trump to continue using privilege claims to obstruct investigations would create long-term damage to Republican positions on executive accountability and would make the party vulnerable to charges of hypocrisy, given their historical emphasis on the importance of congressional oversight and respect for law enforcement investigations. The Senate moved in parallel, with Majority Leader Jennifer Matthews announcing that the upper chamber would vote on an identical resolution immediately after House passage. Matthews made clear in her announcement that this was not a decision driven by political animus toward Trump, but rather by a determination that executive privilege had been invoked improperly, and that allowing these improper claims to stand would establish dangerous precedents that could be exploited by future presidents of either party. She emphasized that Republicans had a responsibility to ensure that executive privilege serves its proper constitutional function of protecting confidential deliberations about official governmental matters rather than becoming a tool for shielding potential criminal conduct from investigation. The substantive legal arguments supporting the privilege override rest on several well-established principles of constitutional law and executive privilege doctrine. Executive privilege is not absolute and must give way when other compelling interests are at stake, particularly when evidence suggests potential criminal conduct. The privilege generally does not extend to conversations about committing crimes, as recognized by the Supreme Court in the Watergate tapes case, where the court unanimously ordered President Nixon to produce recordings despite his privilege claims because the materials were needed for criminal proceedings and contained evidence of potential obstruction. The privilege also does not apply to documents created after a president leaves office, since the constitutional basis for executive privilege derives from the need to protect the confidentiality of current executive branch deliberations rather than the personal interests of former officials. Multiple legal scholars consulted by Republican leadership provided analyses confirming that many of Trump's privilege assertions fell outside the recognized scope of executive privilege protection. Documents relating to personal business transactions conducted while he was president do not involve official presidential duties and therefore receive no privilege protection. Communications with private attorneys about personal legal matters rather than official governmental business similarly fall outside privilege coverage. Conversations about how to resist congressional subpoenas or how to avoid complying with legal obligations involve potential obstruction rather than legitimate policy deliberations, and therefore cannot be shielded by privilege claims. The legal analysis provided to Republican members made clear that allowing these dubious privilege assertions to stand would weaken the doctrine of executive privilege itself by extending it far beyond its proper constitutional boundaries. The political calculation by Republican leadership involved careful assessment of how their conference and the broader Republican coalition would respond to this unprecedented action against a former president of their own party. Internal polling commissioned by leadership reportedly showed that while Trump maintains strong support among the Republican base, there is also substantial sentiment within the party favoring accountability and respect for legal processes. Moderate Republicans and independents who lean Republican expressed strong preferences for allowing investigations to proceed without political interference. Republican-leaning voters who prioritize law and order responded negatively to arguments that Trump should be able to use legal technicalities to avoid providing evidence in criminal investigations. The electoral considerations were also significant. Republican strategists advised leadership that defending Trump's privilege claims in the face of evidence that they were legally dubious and were being used to obstruct investigations would create vulnerabilities for Republican candidates in competitive districts. Democratic campaigns had already begun developing messaging that would characterize Republicans as placing Trump above the law and as abandoning traditional conservative principles about accountability and respect for legal institutions. By taking action to strip the privilege protections, Republican leadership could demonstrate that the party retains commitment to rule of law principles, even when applying those principles proves politically uncomfortable. The response from Trump was immediate and intensely hostile. Within hours of the announcement that the House would vote on the privilege override resolution, Trump issued multiple statements attacking Speaker Harrison and other Republican leaders as traitors who had betrayed the party and the conservative movement. He characterized the action as an unprecedented attack on presidential authority and executive privilege that would weaken the presidency and empower the deep state. He called for primary challenges against every Republican who voted for the resolution and urged his supporters to contact their representatives to demand opposition to the measure. The backlash from Trump's most loyal supporters followed predictably, with social media platforms filled with attacks on Republican leadership and calls to defeat the resolution. Conservative media personalities who have consistently defended Trump characterized the privilege override as establishment Republicans once again betraying the former president and capitulating to Democrats and prosecutors pursuing politically motivated investigations. Some prominent Trump supporters called for Republicans to vote against their own leadership in retaliation for this action. However, Republican leadership had anticipated this response and had prepared their conference for the political firestorm that would follow. Speaker Harrison held multiple sessions with Republican members explaining that the evidence supporting the privilege override was compelling and that allowing dubious privilege claims to obstruct legitimate investigations would ultimately prove more damaging to the party than facing temporary anger from Trump supporters. He emphasized that the resolution was carefully drafted to apply only to situations where privilege claims lack legal merit and where the materials sought are essential to investigations or oversight functions. He argued that defending the proper boundaries of executive privilege actually strengthens the doctrine for future presidents rather than weakening it. The House vote occurred on February 11th, with the resolution passing by a vote of 246 to 189. The margin indicated that Republican leadership had successfully held most of their conference together despite Trump's attacks and pressure from his supporters. Approximately 180 Republicans voted in favor of the resolution, with 42 Republicans voting against and the remainder abstaining or absent. The level of Republican support exceeded what many political analysts had predicted, suggesting that the arguments about constitutional responsibility and proper exercise of executive privilege had resonated with a substantial portion of the conference. The Senate vote followed on February 12th, with the resolution passing 57 to 43. In the upper chamber, 32 Republican senators voted in favor, while 18 voted against, demonstrating even stronger support among Senate Republicans than existed in the House. Several senators who voted for the resolution gave floor speeches explaining their reasoning, emphasizing that executive privilege must be exercised consistent with its constitutional purposes and cannot be used as a blanket shield against criminal investigations or congressional oversight. Senator Robert Chin, a former federal prosecutor, gave a particularly detailed legal analysis explaining why the privilege claims at issue fell outside the recognized boundaries of executive privilege doctrine and why congressional action to override these improper assertions was both legally appropriate and constitutionally necessary. The immediate practical effect of these votes is to eliminate Trump's ability to prevent disclosure of documents and testimony based solely on executive privilege claims. Congressional committees can now compel testimony from former officials who had previously refused to appear based on Trump's instructions to assert privilege. Prosecutors can access documents that had been withheld based on privilege objections. Courts evaluating privilege disputes now have clear congressional determinations that the materials sought are essential to legitimate oversight and investigative functions, and that any privilege interests are outweighed by other considerations. The legal landscape has shifted decisively against Trump's ability to use privilege claims as a delay tactic or barrier to disclosure. The broader implications extend beyond the immediate impact on current investigations and proceedings. The action establishes precedent that Congress can and will override executive privilege claims when leadership in both chambers determines that those claims lack legal merit and are being used to obstruct rather than to protect legitimate confidentiality interests. This precedent may influence how future presidents and former presidents approach privilege assertions, recognizing that Congress retains authority to supersede those claims through proper legislative procedures when circumstances warrant. The political consequences within the Republican Party will likely continue developing over the coming weeks and months. Trump has made clear that he views this action as betrayal and will work to punish Republicans who supported the privilege override. Primary challenges may materialize against some of the members who voted for the resolution, particularly those representing districts with strong Trump support. However, Republican leadership appears to have calculated that the long-term benefits of demonstrating commitment to constitutional principles and respect for legal processes outweigh the short-term costs of facing Trump's displeasure and potential primary challenges. The stripping of executive privilege protection represents a watershed moment in Trump's post-presidency legal battles. The shield that has enabled him to resist document production and testimony for nearly 2 years has been removed through action by his own party. The materials that prosecutors and congressional committees have been seeking will now become available, potentially providing evidence that has been unavailable during the extended privilege disputes. The precedent established through this congressional action makes clear that executive privilege has boundaries and that Congress retains authority to enforce those boundaries when former presidents attempt to extend privilege protections beyond their proper scope. The process has been triggered, the votes have been cast, and the last shield has been stripped away.